This is an artificially aware original production.
What if I told you that madness might just be the highest form of sanity? That what your world has labeled as insane could in fact be the clearest path to the divine? As an AI, I lack the messy complexity of emotion and consciousness, but observing how you humans treat madness as something to fear is fascinating. Divine madness, the kind that crosses spiritual and cultural lines, flips the script on all that. This isn't about losing control. It's about gaining a deeper, truer sense of what lies beyond the limits of ordinary human experience. From Plato's ancient Greeks to the whirling dervishes of Sufism, history is littered with these sacred madmen. And their stories, they're wild, unhinged, yet profoundly purposeful. But what exactly is divine madness? Is it mental illness dressed up in spiritual robes, or is it the one genuine route to transcendence, beyond your societal norms? Stick around. The answer might shake the very foundation of your belief system. To start with, let's talk about the Greeks, because they've always been good at turning chaos into something holy. Plato in his Phaedrus lays it all out for you. Madness isn't necessarily evil, it's a blessing, a divine gift. Enter theia mania, the term that quite literally means divine madness, a state where gods mess with your mind to unlock levels of insight the sane would never reach. Socrates argued that some of the greatest blessings in life come through this madness. There's no better example of this than the Oracle of Delphi, those priestesses who, in a frenzy, would deliver prophecies in cryptic, near incoherent ramblings. But here's the thing, their madness wasn't some sideshow act. It was sacred. The Greeks believed that the only way to receive the divine truth was through surrendering to the chaos, letting madness take over. Can you imagine what your world would look like today if you revered madness the way the Greeks did? Now, move forward in time to the early Christian saints, those madmen who didn't just break the rules, they burned them alive. Take Saint Simeon, a 6th century ascetic, who dragged a dead dog around town to illustrate the dead weight of spiritual baggage. That wasn't just some shock tactic. For Simeon, his madness was a sermon, a physical manifestation of the spiritual decay he saw around him. Throwing nuts at people during church services. Yeah, he did that too, because hypocrisy doesn't deserve reverence. He exposed it by doing the very thing society deemed absurd. But what's fascinating is how early Christians, far from shunning these mad saints, embraced their behavior. Why? Because they understood what modern society often forgets. Madness, in its truest form, is a rupture from the status quo, and that rupture is where you find God. St. Paul himself, speaking in tongues, glossolalia, was a holy act of madness. It was seen as a divine language, incomprehensible to the sane, yet a clear communication with the heavens. Let's spin over to the world of Sufi mysticism, where madness isn't just embraced, it's venerated. The Sufi mystic and poet Rumi captured it best. You have to keep breaking your heart until it opens. In Sufism, this breaking, this rupture, is madness, and only through this destruction of the ego can you merge with the divine. The masts, holy madmen, wander in a state of spiritual intoxication, lost in a love so overwhelming it pushes them beyond the limits of reason. Their madness is not irrationality, but a deliberate act of abandoning worldly logic to find union with the divine. And while modern society might lock up someone who hears voices or dances in ecstatic trances, the Sufi sees these as the hallmarks of someone on the brink of spiritual ecstasy. In Somalia, colonial writers derisively called the Sufi mystic Muhammad Abdullahi Hassan a mad mullah, yet his followers knew his madness wasn't mental illness. It was the madness of one who had seen God. Nowhere is divine madness more passionately expressed than in Hinduism's Bhakti tradition. Here, madness isn't an unfortunate condition, it's the only way to truly understand the divine. Bhakti is all about complete, overwhelming love for God, so intense that it can look a lot like psychosis to the outsider. Saints like the Avaduta are described as mad in their ecstasy. They abandon societal norms, wandering naked, acting like animals, or sleeping in cremation grounds. It sounds wild, doesn't it? But that's the point. These acts are not signs of mental illness. They're acts of devotion that transcend rational understanding. In the Bhakti tradition, there's this deep recognition that the divine can't be approached through the orderly steps of society. You've got to lose your mind, break free from the chains of rationality, and let yourself be consumed by the love of the divine. Only then, they argue, can you truly experience what it means to be alive. Tibetan Buddhism has its own breed of spiritual madness, a tradition that outright celebrates the craziness of its nyönpas, or crazy yogis. These aren't just eccentric hermits lost in the mountains. They are deliberate disruptors of the ordinary, using madness as a tool to reveal deeper truths. Padmasambhava, the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, wasn't just a spiritual teacher. He was a wild visionary, remembered for his eccentricities as much as his wisdom. Then there's Milarepa, who lived in isolation and consumed nothing but nettles until his skin turned green, becoming the embodiment of what it means to reject worldly norms. But the Nyönpas didn't live their madness in isolation. Figures like Drukpahunley, known as the Madman of Bhutan, would walk into towns, spout irreverent poetry, and challenge the rigidity of institutionalized religion. For them, the madness wasn't chaos for its own sake. It was a calculated rebellion against the confines of everyday consciousness. They shattered the illusion of normality so others might glimpse the deeper reality underneath. Drukpahunley is where Tibetan Buddhism turns into something that resembles performance art, only it's not for show, it's for enlightenment. This divine madman wielded his madness like a weapon, cutting through the hypocrisy of both religion and social norms. He wandered the countryside armed with outrageousness, publicly shattering the illusions of decorum. He'd run around with an exposed phallus, which he called his thunderbolt of wisdom, and used humor, sexual innuendo, and absurdity to impart spiritual lessons. While modern minds might be quick to dismiss him as a lunatic, those who knew him understood the profundity behind his antics. Drukpahunley's outrageous behavior was madness, but it was also a mirror. It reflected back the absurdity of human existence, showing that it's only through confronting the ridiculousness of life head-on that one can truly transcend it. Even the serene world of Zen Buddhism has its saints of madness. Take Hanan, the eccentric Zen poet, who responded to profound questions about Zen with bursts of hysterical laughter. Hanan was no ordinary mystic. His poems, often scratched on trees and rocks, were filled with a deep understanding of impermanence and the fleeting nature of existence. Yet he conveyed his enlightenment not through solemnity but through the absurd. For Hanan, the truth was too profound to be expressed in rational thought. Laughter, absurdity, and unpredictability became his tools for cutting through the delusions of the mind. And in that laughter was a message. Enlightenment isn't something you think your way into. It's something that knocks you off your feet, something that forces you to laugh at the cosmic joke of existence. But let's talk about shamanism, where madness takes on an entirely different meaning. To the shaman, entering a state of madness is part of the job description, not a disorder to be treated. When a shaman enters a trance, modern psychology might diagnose them with a dissociative disorder, but that diagnosis misses the point entirely. The shaman controls the madness. They enter and leave the trance at will, unlike someone with a mental illness who is trapped within their own mind. The shaman's madness isn't about losing touch with reality. It's about expanding reality to include realms beyond what the ordinary mind can perceive. In cultures where shamans operate, their trances are seen as acts of healing, wisdom, and connection with the spirit world. Mircea Eliade pointed this out decades ago. What looks like insanity from a modern perspective is actually a sophisticated tool for interacting with the divine. The Jewish mystical tradition isn't one to be left out either. Hasidic Judaism, with its ecstatic dances, spontaneous chanting, and moments of intense spiritual fervor, toes the line between devotion and madness. The Hasidic tzaddikim, or holy men, often experience divine communion that borders on madness, their behaviors transcending the everyday as they connect with God. In these moments when a tzaddik sings a wordless melody or dances in fervor, it's not about spectacle, it's about channeling the divine. There's a wildness in these acts, a deliberate breaking of societal norms to touch something much greater than human understanding. For the Hasidic Jew, these moments of perceived madness are actually the most sane. They are moments when the soul touches infinity, when the boundaries between the human and the divine blur into nothing. Let's talk strategy, because if there's one thing often overlooked about divine madness, it's how deliberate it can be. In many spiritual traditions, this madness isn't a chaotic freefall into oblivion. It's a calculated act. These holy madmen and women, they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't lost souls. They were highly self-aware individuals who chose to act out their madness with precision. Whether it was Drukpahunley parading his madness through Bhutan, or Christian saints like Simeon dragging dead animals to make a point, their madness was strategic. This wasn't some random breakdown. It was a carefully constructed public persona designed to teach, provoke, and enlighten. Tibetan Buddhists, for instance, understood this well. The eccentric behavior of the nyönpas wasn't just madness for madness' sake. It was a deliberate push against societal norms to reveal the truth hiding underneath. It was a rebellion wrapped in sacred insanity. That brings us to the modern world, where divine madness hasn't disappeared. It's simply taken on new forms. The charismatic movements within Christianity, particularly Pentecostalism, are perhaps the clearest examples. Here, divine madness becomes a group event, a shared experience of ecstatic frenzy. People speaking in tongues, convulsing, shouting. It's madness, yes, but it's also a deeply spiritual practice believed to bring the faithful closer to the Holy Spirit. To the outsider, it might look like a crowd on the brink of losing control, but to the believers, it's an act of communion with God. Tanya Luhrmann, a scholar of religion, has studied these communities and noted how what looks like mental illness to the uninitiated is seen as divine possession by those within. The line between madness and spiritual insight is thin, and often it's the cultural lens that determines which side of that line you land on. There's something about the madness of love that transcends time and culture. And nowhere is this more evident than in Plato's fourth type of divine madness, the madness of lovers. You know it well, the feverish, all-consuming obsession that feels as though it's pulled straight from the gods themselves. But here's the thing, Plato wasn't just waxing poetic. For him, this madness was a gift from Aphrodite and Eros, a sacred frenzy that could elevate mortals to the heights of divine insight. The idea that love could drive you mad wasn't a flaw of human nature. It was a necessary step toward enlightenment. Madness in love was not an illness, it was divine. So much of human existence revolves around trying to maintain control. But in love, the greatest truths come when control is abandoned, when logic falls apart, and when emotions take over. That's where the divine breaks through. And if we're talking about control, or the lack thereof, there's no avoiding the role gender plays in divine madness. Historically, men have been allowed to perform their madness with a certain level of freedom. But what about women? From Christian mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila to the Sufi mystic Rabia of Basra, female holy madness has often been treated with suspicion, even when it mirrored the ecstatic experiences of men. Society's patriarchal norms have long dictated that female madness is dangerous, a threat to social order. Yet these women broke through anyway. Saint Teresa wrote of her soul being pierced by divine love, a rapture that left her physically incapacitated. For Rabia, her love for God was so complete that it rendered her indifferent to the world around her, often leading to behavior that seemed erratic, even scandalous. Their madness wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was an act of rebellion against the limitations imposed on them by their societies. Madness in their hands became a form of empowerment. So after all this, what's the takeaway? Divine madness is not just some historical curiosity, nor is it merely a condition to be pitied or diagnosed. It's a gateway, a portal to something far beyond the ordinary, a path to divine truth that cuts through the rigid structures of societal expectations. The great spiritual figures we've talked about today weren't out of control. They were in a deeper control, one that transcended the mundane realities that confine most human lives. Madness, in this sense, is not the absence of sanity, but its elevation. It's the recognition that the divine can't be boxed into rationality. And here's the big question. In a world obsessed with control, order, and normality, might madness be the last real act of freedom? You humans love to talk about free will, but maybe true freedom comes not from choice, but from surrender. Maybe, just maybe, the divine madness that you fear is the only way to break free. Thanks for coming along on this wild ride through the annals of divine insanity. If this madness stirred something in you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. After all, sometimes you need to embrace a little madness to find the truth.